Hey, good afternoon, and welcome to the Insurance Journal's Academy of Insurance's weekly webinar after show. And every week, I always say that I promise to come up with a shorter title for this broadcast, and I have not yet. So I'm on that though. At one of these weeks, I'm going to come up with a much more condensed and toe tapping version of this the show's title. So. This week's webinar was workers' compensation insurance basics or workers' comp insurance basics. And our instructor for that webinar is joining us today for the after show, Mr. Frank Pennachio. And we're also joined by the director of the Insurance Journal's Academy of Insurance, Mr. Patrick Raitt. So, Frank, welcome to the after show. And when we put together the description of the course, there were some specific points of interest or knowledge that you thought might not be covered in, like what the agent or producer or whomever was going to be doing workers' comp didn't know after their training. And there were things like the grand bargain, coverage claims, or what's a claim, state law versus federal law, how to calculate coverage. What is the most sort of widely unknown category in that short list of items that you went over today, and why do you think that is, in your view?
Yeah, it's a great question, George, and thanks for having me. And Patrick, it's a pleasure to be with you folks. I think it's kind of what we wrapped up at the end with, is that work comp appears simple. It's statutory coverage. All the carriers have the same coverage. It varies from state to state, but all the carriers have the same coverage. And the assumption of many agents, and thus then the employers, is that, well, it's all the same. There's no difference in coverage from carrier to carrier, so then all I need to worry about is getting the lowest price. And that is such a false assumption that could be quite dangerous to employers, because as we talked about today, you still have Part 2 employers' liability to program properly. You still have other states travel, employees moving across state lines, which could create problems. There's federal acts exposure that we talked about. And this was even just the basics. So the basics are, it's not as simple as it appears. Yes, coverage is statutory, but it still takes a good agent to properly program the policy to take care of their clients. Otherwise, some significant adverse financial events could occur.
So you mentioned, and you went over this, and I had no idea how different it was from state to state. I thought it might be a national, thing, but it's not. And that's something I wouldn't know if I was getting licensed for, workers' compensation in my own state. I wouldn't be privy to other states' kind of knowledge. So are you more in favor of a national set of standards, or should there be, if we're getting licensed in Indiana, is a course in Illinois workers, is it mandatory? Should it be mandatory, you think, to know this about the neighboring states in case there's coverage in other states that you need to be aware of? Or am I
Great
preaching to the choir?
questions. First, on the federal side, boy, there's days when I wish there was a national standard on a number of different issues. But it gives me pause for thought. And I'm not one of these folks that's like, oh, the government's going to mess everything up. I'm not one of those types of folks. I don't believe that to be the case. But it's just that one of the great things about the states being involved is that they can also be a laboratory. They can try different things. And so I'm a fan of the states doing their thing. Now, when it comes to the education piece, it's hard to find what we talked about today, believe it or not. And then, with should we know what's going on in other states? Yeah, we should. Should we? But where do you find out except through practical experience or maybe an Insurance Journal webinars? Even the rating bureaus. How many people today knew that Pennsylvania does their own thing and they don't share with anybody at all? So it's quite challenging. And we're going to have one of those Zoom work at home moments, folks, if you'll stay with me just a second, because everybody can relate to this. My dog now wants out. So hang on. We're right back at it now.
Sure. Well, this proves that we do these after shows live and off the cuff. Anyone that saw your name now knows how to spell it. So you're serving all kinds of needs here. So yeah.
Does that make sense, George? Does that make sense? It's I've been doing this a long time, so I've learned a lot about other states. We have clients in almost all the states, so our clients are now agents. So you just learn, but it's difficult. Probably the takeaway, the first two questions you've asked is, let's not dumb this down. There's a tendency to dumb it down, and it's not something that we should be dumbing down. It's very complex.
Yeah, and if I could jump in on that, I mean, I've been in the insurance world now 15 years, and workers' comp is not my forte. And I picked up a few things in this today. One of the things that came up as you were showing a map of the U.S. where different states do different things. States such as Pennsylvania or New Jersey that have doing their own thing. Does that require then if a client has got a significant amount of work in those kinds of states, maybe they're based in New York, do they then have to have separate policies for those states?
Great question. It depends on the carrier. Some carriers choose to write in certain states and not others. But even if you find a carrier that says, okay, we'll write New York, New Jersey, New Jersey, Connecticut, we'll write that. But then it's up to the agent to get the New Jersey manual, which is different than the New York manual, which is probably more similar. The New York's probably more similar to the Connecticut manual. Connecticut's NCCI, New York's independent. So then they, as we mentioned in the webinar, they become NCCI. But it's a different set of rules. Not dramatically. It's not night and day, black and white. But there have been times when I say, this is the way it is, but let me check the manual in your state and find it to be different. Now, some states are just like you mentioned, New York, New Jersey. Not a lot of people like to write New York. They just don't. They don't find it to be a favorable marketplace. So you have a set, or they'll write New York, but they won't write that other state's coverage. They'll simply say, we're not interested. Well, how do you write New York when you're separated by another state by a river? I mean,
sure.
The people are going back and forth all the time. So it can get challenging, especially when you're dealing with state funds that assign risk pools and residual markets. It's not their intent to write other states' coverage. Right. And that's something else that people just fail to understand, or they have a very, very limited other states' endorsement. So agents have to be real careful about that.
Yeah, I was going to ask you if you preferred teaching a basics course over a more complicated or a complex course, but it really all is complex, and it's like a game of chess. Like the first move could be potentially 16 moves, and then the next move could be 138 moves, and so forth. So there is no basic understanding of workers' compensation, it sounds like.
That's a great point, George. Today was fun. It was as much as I really wanted to hit just the basics. Even with the basics, there's some complexity mixed in there, as you just said.
Yeah, and when you add into the mix, you were talking about. I'm going to mess it up. Longshoremen, the right. Federal, right. deal. You made mention of that. You thought perhaps there was navigable water between from Florida, and actually looked it up. There is a lake in Georgia that goes into Florida, and there's navigable water there. So you've got intrastate movement there.
Right. And that's complicated. And then you've got, these rivers that empty into the Gulf and empty into the Atlantic. And the rule allegedly is if you throw a log into the water, can it find its way to the Atlantic, Pacific, Gulf of Mexico, or another state? and that makes it navigable. So it's exceedingly complex and very challenging. A lot of carriers don't like to sell the coverage, period. They certainly don't like to offer it on an incidental or if any basis.
Sure.
What agents' responsibility there is to raise the awareness of their clients. So you likely have this risk. And here's a couple of different ways we can handle it. One of which, of course, is if you're not making enough money on it, just avoid it. Just avoid it. Just stay away from it. That's hard to do in Florida, by the way. It's very difficult to do in Florida. We're surrounded by water on three sides and have rivers to boot. But at the very least, be aware of the risk and decide how you want to handle it. And even if it means that you have to buy a minimum premium monoline policy, which you may feel like, wow, that's a waste of money. I don't even know if I have the exposure. All it takes is for one employee to go to one attorney, an attorney to say, you know what, let's roll the dice on USL&H. We don't know if we'll get it deemed compensable under the federal act or not, but let's take a shot. Well, the employer's on the hook through that whole process.
Right.
Even if it doesn't get deemed to be compensable, they have hundreds of thousands of dollars of defense costs. And then if it is deemed compensable, they're out of pocket for the benefits, which are very rich.
Yeah. You had mentioned monopolistic states, and one of the things that stuck out at me as we were talking about that, and I know this wasn't the class for it, but West Virginia used to be a monopolistic state. And do you remember dealing with the transition between, when you had as you mentioned, a CGL policy with a stopgap endorsement attached, and transitioning over to they had it that stood up a carrier from their monopolistic company.
Right. As a matter of fact, that carrier's a client of ours. So we've been very close to that situation from almost day one. An extraordinary success in going private in West Virginia. The costs have come down like 70%. It's been an extraordinary success story. And yes, that transition. It's helpful to get enabling legislation that puts together a good law that takes care of employees and puts some guardrails around the system, which they did a great job there. And then the insurance company that evolved out of the state fund, formerly known as Brick Street, now they affiliated with motorists to create a company called Encova, and some of the brightest and smartest people I've ever met. And they did their homework. They traveled the country. They found all the best practices, and they developed some of their own. They brought in the talent, and they are proving that done right, we can take really good care of employees because they got a clean sweep. They got it's like, okay, here's you don't have 100 years of selling work comp. You're opening your doors day one. Now, of course, I don't know if you know the story behind this, but just as an anecdote, on day one was the Sago mine disaster. Their entire surplus went away the very first day they opened their doors.
That's right.
Because they insure 100% of the entire state. The day one they opened their doors. January 1st, January 2nd, the Sago mine disaster occurred, wiped out their surplus the first day they were in business. And they recovered from that. And it's just an amazing success story. So, and that's not, please don't take that as monopolistic states do a bad job and private companies do a good job. Ohio's got great success stories. Washington's got great success stories. I don't know much about Wyoming, North Dakota, because just never had much economic activity from agents in those states. We had a little bit of activity in North Dakota when fracking got first going, and that was just such a disaster because the state just got overrun. People were living in tents and campers because it was like the great gold rush. People went to North Dakota to get great paying jobs, and they were literally living in tents in cold weather. But Washington State does a fine job. There's great success stories that come out of there. Ohio, they had some problems years ago. They've righted their ship. They're doing well. And West Virginia is an amazing success story, just a stunning success story. So this system can work well.
Sure.
It really can work well, and it's intended to let's take care of injured employees. That's the purpose.
Is there anything you left out of today's webinar that, I think you seem like you made all the points you wanted to, but anything you would have gotten into more detail on that you didn't cover that would have been your druthers too?
It's George, it's a bit seducing to talk more about predictive analytics and how underwriting is changing. And I wanted to be careful. I wanted to touch it so that here I am talking about classifications and the premium algorithm and showing people that, because that's what they're going to see. Behind the curtain, different things are happening. It's still likely going to show up on the declarations page the way we showed it on today's webinar. But as I also mentioned, we may have arrived at the price first and then reverse engineered back up through the algorithm. So that's a little bit seductive. You want to talk about that. There's some people that are pushing back on that, saying it's not happening. I had, here's the world in which I live. A very, very close friend at the carrier that go back decades with, who tells me what's happening inside the sausage factory. And then I have a very, very close friend that I've known for decades at the National Council of Compensation Insurance, NCCI, who says, no, we're not seeing it that way. So, and then we've got agents that have to go out on the street and somehow reconcile that the rating bureau is saying, we're doing a study on the experience rating system and it's working, and a carrier saying, oh, we're not paying attention to that too much anymore. We got the brightest people on the planet helping us build predictive analytics through big data models, machine learning algorithms, and machine learning and artificial intelligence. Agents need to know both sides and try to reconcile it. What does all this matter to an agent? Well, ultimately, you want to stay out of trouble. You don't want to go to a client and say, your experience mod is 1.20. I'm going to help you drive it down to 0.80, and we're going to reduce your premiums by 40%. That's likely not true anymore. There's likely not a direct relationship. And I like to use conditional words like likely. If this wasn't being recorded and we were someplace else, I'd say that is just not true. But maybe there's somebody somewhere, someplace that I haven't met that still has a direct relationship between the mod points and the premium. That is typically not the case. Notice how these words end in ly. Likely, typically, usually. Maybe somebody's doing it. But agents need to know things are changing dramatically. And you don't want to get embarrassed, and you don't want to lose credibility. You don't want to mislead people knowingly or unknowingly. And it's not easy for agents to hear that the ground is shifting beneath their feet at a rapid pace, and they need to amp up, learn, keep learning, as Patrick says, and bring that information to the marketplace and help people become aware. Look, business owners have heard about artificial intelligence and machine learning and big data. This is not, would they be shocked and surprised if the insurance industry didn't integrate that when we're in the data predicting business? Come on, people know stuff's happening. Let's be transparent about it and let's share it with them. And there's some things we don't know exactly how it works, but we know that there's different ways of pricing risk today than there ever have been. And it's going to continue to accelerate. There's different ways of adjudicating claims today. There's different ways of underwriting policies and issuing them. And it's going to continue to emerge. So agents should really be aware of that.
Gotcha. Thank you so much, Frank. Really appreciate your time and your expertise. Excellently rendered. Another LY word, so thank you. And Patrick, I wanted to ask you about next week's webinar, which you're going to be the instructor of, Commercial Property Masterclass, our next installment in that several month ongoing class. And this one is additional coverages, coverage extensions, and optional coverages. Can you say a few words about next week's webinar, please?
Yeah, sure, George. Thanks. And I'm looking forward to next week because I like to dig into the details of the policies. And next week we're dealing with some of the intricate pieces of the additional coverages, things like your debris removal, your coverage extensions, things like newly acquired properties, and the optional coverages such as replacement cost. And what I like about this, about being able to do it this way with our Commercial Property Masterclass, is we get to take our time and dig into the details of the ISO CP 0010, find out what's covered, what's not covered, what all these different these different optional coverages and additional coverages, what all that means to the policy. Why is it an additional coverage as opposed to why might it be a coverage extension, and handle some of these from a more detailed perspective. So I'm looking forward to it. In fact, I've got that Word document with my notes open on the other screen, still working on some of the content, pulling it out and getting some good stories together. But we're looking forward to that next installment of the Commercial Property Masterclass. Fun.
Great. Thank you so much. Well, on behalf of our esteemed guest instructor today, Mr. Frank Pennachio, and our director, Mr. Patrick Great, this is your host, George. I'd like to say thanks again for tuning into the after show, and we'll look forward to seeing you at next week's webinar. And if you have any suggestions about a shortened title for the after show, please send them to support@ijacademy.com, and I'd be happy to get any help with this whatsoever. So, gentlemen, thank you so much, and we will see you next time. So take care and stay safe.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Thanks, Frank. Thanks, George. Take care.